Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentwich, and I'm here to record another presentation about the title of the presentation is the Paradigmatic Crisis and Paradigmatic Shift of 21st century physics, which is the new God's physics paradigm. I remind everybody that there's a book of mine, God's Physics, that was published by iuniverse.com, available online as well. So the topic of today's conversation, today's lecture, is the significant paradigmatic crisis that science or physics, 21st century physics, finds itself in. As I've said in previous presentations, we stand now at an equivalent point to where science or theoretical physics stood 100 years ago. And that means that as the known philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn discovered and published in 1962 the structure of scientific revolutions, and he actually analyzed the way in which science evolves, any scientific discipline evolves. And he taught us that science undergoes two alternating phases. The first phase is called the standard science, in which any scientific discipline like physics operates and investigates and carries out scientific investigation as defined within a specific paradigm. So if we take the example of Einstein 100 years ago, when he came along in 1905, science back then was in a state of a paradigmatic crisis. So we have the scientific paradigm, the standard science, let's say Newtonian mechanics, before Einstein, in 19th century physics, operated quite well, and scientists could carry out investigations and experiments and discover phenomena that all fell within and conformed to the old paradigm of Newtonian mechanics. And that's fine and well. But then Thomas Kuhn tells us that there comes a phase in any scientific discipline where, for example, the old Newtonian mechanics starts having significant problems. That's called a state of a paradigmatic crisis. That's the state we're in right now, which I'm going to discuss and also point out what's the way out of this paradigmatic crisis, which is to undergo the paradigmatic shift into the new God's physics paradigm. But I just wanna outline where we stand so that the viewers can understand where we stand and what's necessary right now. And we stand at an exciting time, and no doubt, because this is a turning point in science evolution. So Thomas Kuhn is telling us, okay, so there was the standard paradigm, for example, Newtonian mechanics, and for a while it works. Then after a while, in the state of a paradigmatic crisis, there starts being all sorts of inconsistencies and incompatibilities within the old paradigm. So in the case of Newtonian mechanics, we saw that Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian electromagnetic theory seem to be inconsistent. They seem to contradict each other. That's obviously a state or a situation in science that cannot be tolerated. And then we saw also, that's another thing that Thomas Kuhn talks about, when we see that there are certain phenomena, major phenomena, that cannot be explained by the old paradigm. In the case of Newtonian mechanics, that was the ether concept, because scientists back then and Newtonian mechanics assumed that the whole universe is perfused by this fine element called the ether. And yet, and Newtonian mechanics was relying and based on the existence of the ether, and yet multiple experiments to try and identify that ether element failed. Again, the most known experiment was Michelson-Morley's experiment, which failed to detect the presence of the ether. So when Thomas Kuhn is telling us, so we have the standard science, Newtonian mechanics, then we have the paradigmatic crisis, a state where the old standard paradigm, in this case Newtonian mechanics, cannot any longer hold. There's inconsistencies, it cannot explain major phenomena such as the ether. Then science and scientists begin understanding that there must be a paradigmatic shift. There is a paradigmatic crisis the old paradigm or the standard paradigm is not working any longer, and there's a need to expand the scope of our understanding, to expand the paradigm into the new paradigm. That means a paradigmatic shift from the old paradigm, which doesn't work any longer, in this case Newtonian mechanics, to the new paradigm, in that case relativity theory, which can explain those inconsistencies, can resolve them, can explain that those unexplained phenomena. In the case of Einstein, Einstein discarded the ether concept. He said, if we cannot detect the ether concept or element, even though we try many times to do that, so science at the end of the day is a precise empirical verification based endeavor. So if we cannot find the ether, we have to discard it. And then this paradigmatic crisis then led to the paradigmatic shift of relativity theory. Now, why do I spend time to explain and elaborate about this paradigmatic crisis and paradigmatic shift? Because it teaches us a lot about where we stand and what is happening and what needs to happen in science right now. We stand at an equivalent point, because right now we have a basic, we're in a paradigmatic crisis. And in fact, from Einstein's initial quest of a unifying field theory, which began closely after the verification of his general relativity theory in 1919, we're going to talk about that. But Einstein's quest towards a unifying field theory, to unify between the two pillars of the old, what I call material-causal paradigm of 20th century physics, between relativity theory, which talks about the macroscopic scale, relativistic scale of the galaxies and the universe, and between quantum mechanics, which talks about the microscopic scale of subatomic particles. These two pillars seem to contradict each other. Again, this indicates a paradigmatic crisis. And just maybe as an example, a glaring example of this principal inconsistency, apparent inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, when we take the phenomena of quantum entanglement, which I'll elaborate in a second, that seems to contradict relativity's theory insistence upon the constancy of the speed of light, the light barrier for transmission of information, essentially the causal material assumption of relativity theory. Even though, by the way, quantum mechanics also is part of this old material causal paradigm. Because quantum relativity theory tells us that there is a light barrier, speed of light barrier for the transmission of information. And I give the example, many people give that example, that if the sun was extinguished, God forbid, right now it would take 8 minutes for the last light ray to travel from the sun to our planet Earth, and therefore we would not know for another 8 minutes until the last ray of sunlight has reached Earth. Then we would know after 8 minutes that the sun was extinguished, God forbid. If we take an equivalent situation with quantum mechanics, we have two entangled particles, then they are separated, and we create a situation that is similar. So they're separated now by, let's say, 8 minutes of light traveling pathway time interval. But what we found, what Bell's experiment verified, is that if we measure one of these entangled particles, instantaneously the other entangled particle would correspond, or we actually are determining by measuring one entangled particle what will be the complementary pair measurement accuracy for the other entangled particle. So in fact, we see a situation that as if measurement of one particle instantaneously, it doesn't take the 8 minutes for the light signal to reach the other particle. Instantaneously, it, so to speak, jumps over space and time and determines the other particle's values. So this is, for example, a contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. There are other features to this inconsistency, but that would be maybe one glaring example. So again, this and, by the way, the other element, so we see a theoretical inconsistency between the two pillars of the old material causal paradigm. which indicates a paradigmatic crisis. And the other thing, which is equivalent to what happened with Newtonian mechanics and the paradigmatic crisis in Newtonian mechanics, is the phenomena, the major phenomena of the accelerated expansion of the universe. We know when we look at the stars and galaxies that they're drifting apart, and the rate of that expansion is accelerated. And so when the old material-causal paradigm needs to explain that, the only way that it can explain this major phenomena of the accelerated expansion of the universe is by assuming that there exists up to 95% of all the mass and all the energy in the universe, which is assumed to comprise dark matter and dark energy. And obviously, the situation where now for 2 decades, multiple teams of scientists have been looking for and doing experiments to try and detect that purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, but they've failed to find that directly. So that, again, like the ether concept, is a situation which is very problematic. It indicates a major paradigmatic crisis for the old 20th century paradigm, the material-causal paradigm. And therefore it forces science to do what Thomas Kuhn indicated and what Einstein carried out 100 years ago, and that is to make a paradigmatic shift from the old inadequate material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics to the new God's physics paradigm. And that, again, I'm going to talk about the call for astronomers, cosmologists to carry out now a time-sensitive measurement of a critical prediction of the new paradigm in order to actually make that shift completely. But first, I think it's becoming clear that we're standing now at the heart of a paradigmatic crisis and actually at a paradigmatic shift from the old material-causal paradigm to the new God's physics acausal computation paradigm. So maybe it's a good point to just briefly illustrate or explain what's the difference between the old material-causal paradigm and the new acausal computation God's physics paradigm. And that would also lead us to the very important call that I'm making now. 2 special issues have come out about this new paradigm of 21st century physics, which is God's physics paradigm. Previously, I called that paradigm the computational unified field theory. There's been over 50 peer-reviewed scientific articles published. I've been invited to open international conferences, physics conferences, with a lecture about this new paradigm. So it would be very it's helpful for us to understand what's the difference between the principal difference between the old material-causal paradigm and the new acausal computation God's physics paradigm. So let me say a few words about this, and then we'll move on to understanding what's the call that I'm making for cosmologists, astronomers, to carry out a specific experiment that can actually validate and allow for the whole scientific community to accept the new God's physics paradigm as the new paradigm for 21st century theoretical physics. So what's the difference between the old material-causal paradigm and the new God's physics acausal computation paradigm? The old material-causal paradigm assumed that everything in the universe operates by cause and effect. By material interactions of cause and effect, that's how you can explain any phenomena in the universe. That's the old paradigm. Remember, we spoke about the standard paradigm with certain assumptions. The old paradigm of material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics has a certain assumption, and that assumption is that everything can be explained. Everything in the universe can be explained as a result, as arising from cause and effect interactions between certain material elements. Give you an example. Relativity theory, general relativity theory, assumes the Big Bang model, which essentially says that the whole universe evolved as a result of an initial nuclear event. That nuclear event created suns, galaxies, matter, energy, space, time. The whole creation and evolution of the universe is assumed to be explained by this material-causal physical interaction between the initial Big Bang nuclear event and its creation of suns, galaxies, etc. The same way, general relativity tells us, Einstein's equations tells us the way that the universe evolves can be explained strictly by cause and effect material interactions between massive objects, such as the sun, which curves space-time around it. Because it curves space-time around it, that would then determine the traveling pathways, in this case, of the planets in our solar system. But more generally, the whole universe operates by this curvature of space-time around massive objects. And that curvature of space-time due to massive objects then determines or causes the traveling pathways of massive and less massive objects. So that's again a material-causal assumption. If we take quantum mechanics, the same idea, except in the microscopic subatomic realm, because quantum mechanics tells us that if you want to study and understand any subatomical phenomena, particle, wave, subatomical particles, etc., forces, 3 forces of nature, etc., 4 forces of nature. So when we want to explain that, we say, okay, we're measuring the interaction. The assumption is that the whole subatomical quantum mechanical way in which the subatomic realm operates is by material interaction, cause and effect, material interaction between subatomical target element, which is assumed to comprise a probability wave function, and then that subatomical target particle meets another corresponding probe subatomical element or particle or wave, and that subatomical probe element then creates that interaction, creates the collapse, causes the collapse of the probability wave function of the target element into a singular complementary space energy time mass value. So this is again a cause and effect material interaction assumption. Again, when we understand that science has reached the end, the limit of that old paradigm, again due to the inconsistent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, due to the fact that a major phenomena of the accelerated expansion of the universe is explained by dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts, which comprise up to 95% of the mass and energy in the universe, but cannot be observed. That's a paradigmatic crisis, and we need to move into the paradigmatic shift towards the new God's physics paradigm. So we want to understand now what's the difference between the old material-causal paradigm, which assumes that everything in the universe operates by cause and effect between material entities, to the new paradigm, and not by chance, by providence. This new God's physics paradigm, I called it the acausal computation paradigm. And that acausal computation paradigm essentially says, first of all, it's based on the discovery of a singular, higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle. So the UCP, Universal Computational / Consciousness Principle, the UCP, is discovered, and that's a singular, higher ordered principle which is assumed or postulated to compute simultaneously every exhaustive spatial pixel in the universe. And it does so at the incredible rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, which equals 1.36 in the power of minus 50 per second. So it's an extremely rapid series of frames, universal frames, because at every minimal time point, many trillions of times per second, every minimal time point, the UCP creates a whole universal frame, and that whole universal frame essentially comprises the whole universe simultaneously at the minimal time point. Between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP. So the discovery of the UCP, the Universal Computational / Consciousness Principle, essentially tells us, it shifts science from this material-causal assumption to what I call the acausal computational paradigm, new paradigm. And the idea is very simple. If think about the fact that if indeed the UCP computes simultaneously all the spatial pixels in the universe simultaneously, each frame is computed simultaneously, and between one frame and another the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP, there cannot be any cause and effect, any material interaction between any 2 points or more. Any points, any 2 or more points in a frame cannot interact because they're produced simultaneously. and between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP, so there cannot be interaction between one frame and another frame. So we get into this new acausal computational paradigm, which essentially tells us the universe is not a material-causal element or phenomena or system, but rather it's acausal, the universal computational / consciousness principle. It produces this series of frames, and in fact, again, 50 plus articles have been written about this, but in fact we see that the way the UCP drives the universe and evolves the universe is based on its arrangement and production of a series of frames, and so much so that there is a pre-planned program or pre-planned scheme of this universal computational principle, consciousness principle, to evolve the whole universe from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and up to the perfected, what I call geula state, perfected state, which is moral, spiritual, and even physical, of humanity, and of the recognition of humanity and science, of this oneness, this singularity of this universal computational / consciousness principle. But I don't want to devote this talk too much to theoretical considerations. It's much more about recognizing that science stands now at a major paradigmatic crisis, and in fact at a major paradigmatic shift towards the new, from the old material-causal paradigm, which assumes things happen by cause and effect, to the new acausal computation, God's physics paradigm, which views the world in a very different way. There is no cause and effect in the material sense. There is an evolution of the universe and a production, dissolution, reproduction, evolution of every spatial pixel and of the whole universe solely by the doings or the operation of this singular higher order universal consciousness principle or reality, which again seems to have a whole plan of how to evolve the universe. Now, how is this relevant now to science and what needs to happen? So we said, I'm taking us again 100 years back, and Thomas Kuhn tells us when there is a paradigmatic crisis, there needs to be a paradigmatic shift towards the new paradigm. How does this happen? So we find out this is by what Einstein was doing. In a sense, it's derived from Kuhn's analysis of the evolution of science. When we get to that point of a paradigmatic crisis, it forces science to make the paradigmatic shift to the new paradigm. But the only way that science will accept a new paradigm is by making a critical contrast between at least one or two critical predictions of the new paradigm that are significantly different from the corresponding predictions of the old paradigm, and which also allow scientists, experimentalists, to test and see which of the predictions is right. So I'm giving the example of Eddington's verification of Einstein's critical prediction. Einstein identified a critical prediction based on what we're saying and what Kuhn was saying. He identified a critical prediction in which the prediction of his back then new relativity theory, general relativity theory, would be different than the predictions of the old Newtonian mechanics. And that critical prediction was, as we all know, regarding the double-valued curvature of Mercury's perihelion pathway around the Sun. Remember, Einstein's general relativity theory tells us that massive objects curve space and time. So the Sun, which is a massive object, relatively massive object, curves space and time around it, and based on that new theory, that new understanding, that new paradigm, what was predicted is that therefore the pathway of Mercury's perihelion around the Sun would be twice as curved as what predicted by Newtonian mechanics, 1.6 as opposed to 0.8 arc. And so this was a critical prediction of what Einstein predicted relative to what Newton predicted. And that's a great thing, because then it allows scientists such as Eddington, bold experimentalists such as Eddington, to carry out that measurement and in fact decide, allow science to decide which of these paradigms is more valid. And again, in 1919, Solar Eclipse of 1919, Eddington and two other expeditions tried to verify which of these predictions was correct, and Eddington was successful and actually verified that the curvature of Mercury's perihelion around the Sun is 1.6 rather than 0.8 as predicted by Newtonian mechanics. And overnight, pretty much, Einstein's theory, general relativity theory, was accepted as the new paradigm for 20th century physics, which included Newtonian mechanics as a special case. But it was decided and accepted that Einstein's general relativity theory is more valid than Newtonian mechanics old paradigm. And we stand at exactly the same point, and that's why I've identified a specific critical prediction of this new God's physics paradigm. A few of them, by the way, I've written about it, but one of them is time sensitive. That's why I'm making these presentations, video presentations, special articles, keynote opening talks, and I'm calling urgently now cosmologists, astronomers to carry out a time-sensitive measurement of the critical prediction of this new God's physics paradigm. And so I'm going to explain that briefly. The idea is that if as we said before, one of the biggest problems of the old paradigm, which in a sense comprised part of this paradigmatic crisis of the old material-causal paradigm, is the fact that the old material-causal paradigm cannot really explain the accelerated expansion of the universe. It explains it by this purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy, which is assumed to comprise up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe. And so that's, according to the old paradigm, there is the dark matter, dark energy, and needless to say that those are problematic because they cannot be observed. But I'm just contrasting between the old paradigm's material-causal paradigm prediction and the new critical prediction of God's physics paradigm. So according to the old material-causal paradigm, the universe is expanding at an accelerated rate, constant accelerated rate, due to dark matter, dark energy. So the universe is expanding all the time at the same accelerated rate, which remains constant. The new God's physics paradigm tells us something different. It tells us that the reason that the universe is expanding at an accelerated rate is not because of dark matter, dark energy, because as we said, there cannot be any cause and effect due to the fact that the UCP simultaneously computes each consecutive frame. So how does it explain the accelerated expansion of the universe? It's elaborate. I'm going to try and simplify it. It tells us that the reason that the universe expands at an accelerated rate is due to the Universal Computational Consciousness Principle's operation. But it tells us something surprising. It tells us that whenever you have, that's one of the theoretical postulates of this new God's physics paradigm, tells us that that theoretical postulate is called the collective human consciousness focus. It tells us that whenever you have a collective focus of a group of human beings, all focusing on this universal computational / consciousness principle, that brings about a non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. And that, I give the example of the Jewish Rosh Hashana 2 days time interval. That's when I'm calling astronomers, cosmologists to test that critical prediction. And I'm calling astronomers, cosmologists, please test during the upcoming Rosh Hashana, Jewish New Year Rosh Hashana, which is on the 7th and 8th of September 2021, please test and measure the rate of the universe's expansion before Rosh Hashana, so that is, let's say, 2 weeks before the 7th and 8th of September 2021, and compare that rate of acceleration to the new increase, that's a prediction, new increase in the universe's rate of expansion, accelerated rate of expansion, from the 7th, 8th, Rosh Hashana, and after that. And the prediction is very simple. Whenever you have this collective human consciousness, where in this case millions of Jews all over the world are focusing on this universal consciousness reality, in religious terms it would be called God. Whenever you have this focus of millions of individuals, in this case the Jewish people, millions of Jews focusing and praying to God, to this universal consciousness reality in scientific terms, you would have then a non-continuous increase in the rate of acceleration of the universe. And that can be measured. That's the call for cosmologists and astronomers. Now, to the extent that this will be verified, that in fact we would see that the rate of acceleration of the universe before the 7th and 8th of September 2021 would be significantly smaller than the rate of acceleration of acceleration from the 7th, 8th, and carrying out through the whole next year, New Year Jewish year time interval. If that would be the case, this cannot be explained obviously by the old material-causal paradigm. Why? Of general relativity theory. Why? Because we said the old paradigm says it's dark matter, dark energy. The universe expands at a constant accelerated rate. There's no non-continuous leaps or increases in the rate of acceleration. And for sure, it's not related in any form or fashion to collective human consciousness. But if we find, in fact, that during the Rosh-Hashana, which is one instant of a collective human consciousness focus, we find that during that collective human consciousness focus interval of 2 days, the Jewish Rosh Hashanah of September 7th and 8th, we'll find out that during those 2 days, and ensuing the whole next Jewish year after these 2 days, there is an increase, there is a non-continuous increase in the rate of acceleration. Then we would have to accept, science would have to embrace the new paradigm, the God's physics paradigm, as the valid new paradigm, a causal computation paradigm of 21st century physics. Obviously, this is after the 50 plus articles which have shown that the new God's physics paradigm is able to resolve the apparent inconsistencies between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. It offers a much broader understanding of the universe, and at the center of that understanding is what I call the Universal Computational formula. Recently, it's been expanded into the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions Universal Computational formula. But in any event, it's a Universal Computational formula which is based on this Universal Computational / consciousness principle operation. How that formula indicates how this UCP simultaneously computes every spatial pixel in the universe, and it does quite significant things for science. And that's why I would spend now just a few minutes to explain why this measurement is so significant and why I'm calling urgently the cosmologists and astronomers of the world, the bold astronomers and cosmologists, to carry out this measurement, which is equivalent to what Eddington has done for science. If it's verified, if and when it's verified, science would undergo a major paradigmatic shift, because no longer we would view the universe as a continuous, constant, material, causal entity. The new paradigm makes a tremendous and very significant shift in our understanding of the universe. The universe has not been created by a Big Bang, because the universe is being created and recreated, dissolved, recreated, and produced and evolved at the amazing, unfathomable rate of many trillions of times per second by this higher ordered Universal Computational / consciousness principle. The new Universal Computational formula that I talked about, it appears, by the way, even on the covering of this Universal God's Physics book. At the bottom here is the Universal Computational formula. So that Universal Computational formula actually is able, for the first time in science, to unify completely between the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass. For the first time in physics, it's able to unify and explain the four forces of nature, including gravitational force. For the first time in science, human beings and their moral choices, our moral choices, are very significant, because according to this new theory, this Universal Computational / consciousness principle contains multiple possible futures, all past, present, and multiple possible future frames are contained in this Universal Computational principle. I call it the multi-spatial temporal reservoir. But according to the moral decisions that we human beings make, this instigates a choice or a selection of one of multiple possible futures by this Universal Consciousness principle reality, based on a moral principle, the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, which is an integral part of this Universal Consciousness principle. And beyond that, by the way, this new model principally is able to go beyond the speed of light barrier. It's able to reverse time. It's able to do things that are very significant for science. So the topic of this brief talk is the paradigmatic crisis and paradigmatic shift of the new God's physics 21st century paradigm. And in all of the conversations and talks that I'm recording and presenting, I'm calling again and again urgently cosmologists and astronomers to utilize this very special time-sensitive interval of Rosh Hashana, of the Jewish New Year, on the 7th and 8th of September 2021, measured 2 weeks before and 2 weeks from 7th and 8th onwards, and verify or validate or test this critical prediction of the new God's physics paradigm. I'm quite confident that astronomers, cosmologists, bold astronomers and cosmologists would carry out this critical prediction, and we stand the possibility of science embracing an exciting new paradigm of 21st century, which is God's physics, which would advance not just the knowledge and the scope of science, but it would advance also the state of humanity in very significant ways. Thank you very much.